For our final track analysis, we're going to be looking at more of an experimental example. And when I say experimental, all I mean by that is we can't really fit this particular song into any kind of genre, at least not into a popular genre that the majority of people are well aware of. If you take the first example of Paul's track, clearly that's a dance track, a steady beat all the way through. Things kind of evolve when they're supposed to. When you look at that second track example, the one that I made, it's kind of moving in a slightly different direction. You don't normally expect to hear a lot of little snippets from old movies coming in and going out, but you could still tell that there was a beat. It was more of a hip hop sort of thing, and most listeners would pick up on that. With this track, you're not going to find that at all. Now, some people might refer to this as more art music, meaning that it's designed to really be listened to and analyzed, but I don't want the pretension that comes along with that term to trip you up and to make you think that you can't make something like this, or that you also can't appreciate something like this, because I think there's a lot to be learned in this track, but some of the lessons are going to be a little bit different than the lessons from the first two examples. So while listening, we have a few questions to ask ourselves yet again. The first question, was there a plan? The second question, is there a definite logic to the arrangement? Those first two might be a little bit trickier to answer than before. How is the flow of energy handled in the track? Is there a real flow of energy at all? Consider that. And then the last question, are you able to make sense of this composition? Why or why not? So really think about those things as we go on to listen to the track. Even just by looking at this waveform, we can tell that there's something a little bit different here. It's not very often that we see a professional track kind of having this odd bending shape going on. And if it was to happen, I'm sure that whoever's in charge would be freaking out. But in the case of experimental music, there's nothing out of bounds. You can do anything for the sake of doing it. And if the result sounds cool or you think other people might find it interesting, then you're always going to do it. So here we go. Let's take a listen.
You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing. Sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing. Sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body, taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. You make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world. Make it sound as if taking over another body was the easiest thing in the world.
Perhaps answering these questions while you were listening was a little bit more difficult than in the past. And if it was a little bit more difficult, that's totally okay, because experimental music is all about actively listening and trying to understand and make sense of what you're listening to. So I'll review these, and it's actually a good thing that I'm the person who made the track, so I can answer these definitively. But for some of you, you might even disagree with my logic here, and that's okay. That's part of this music. It's up for interpretation. It's up for critique. So was there a plan? There most definitely was a plan, and every single move was intentional because this was very much a concept-driven track. When you look at the project, you'll see how there was kind of a pattern that was going on, and that was something that I knew I was going to do beforehand. The result, I wasn't 100% sure how the result was going to turn out, but I did have a plan, and I really stuck to my guns with that plan, even when there were moments when things weren't sounding too great. Was there a logic to the arrangement? Again, you might say, no, there really wasn't, but actually there was. There was a pretty strict logic that I adhered to, and if you listen to this track in general, there is kind of a cheesy overtone throughout the whole thing, which is we have that vocal phrase talking about taking over someone's body. And then as the track continues on, it starts to break down. We add more effects. We start to make things more abstract until at the very end, it's almost as if the person's body has been taken over and they really haven't had a whole lot of control over it. So if you go back and listen, kind of having that in mind, you'll be like, oh yeah, that makes sense, but it might not be something that you notice on the very first listen if you were just listening to the sonic results and how those effects were impacting the various parts and how things were moving around in the stereo field. How is the flow of energy handled? This one is definitely subjective, and even I would say I'm not 100% sure on this one. What we do know is that more and more effects are building up. Those vocal phrases are coming closer and closer together. Things are getting mushier. Things are getting blurrier. But it's really difficult to talk about the energy of this track when we've just been talking about the energy of Paul's track and my other genre-based track. It's coming from a totally different direction, and it's not meant to push people onto the dance floor or anything like that. This track is more meant to just be listened to and to be critiqued and analyzed. And the last question, are you able to make sense of this composition? Some of you might say, yeah, that was really cool. Others of you might say that was the biggest waste of 3 minutes of my entire life. But hopefully as we go along with this presentation, you might start to change your opinion on that a little bit. So this time for the Taking a Closer Look segment, we'll spend a little bit more time talking about the theory and a little less time looking at the project, because there's not a whole lot to be gained from the project, mainly because you need to have an idea of what you want to accomplish. Before I went inside of Soundation, I knew pretty much exactly what I was going to do the second I heard that particular sample. And much like in the last track, I used this sample, and it was the only sample that was used in the entire track. And I used it because I bought that sample pack. So I felt like I really should make an effort to use it. I heard the taking over your body. I thought, okay, I can easily deconstruct this and I can, at the end, turn it into something completely abstract. I could have made it a lot more evil and crazy with lots of distortion booms coming in and out. But then I thought it would have been not very coherent. It would have just gone a little bit too far. So some of the main ideas that I'd like you to take away from this example is process over product, which just means that you can learn a lot by having an idea and trying to execute it. It doesn't have to be something as experimental as this. It can even be for your own genre works. But I had an idea of what I wanted to try to do, and I was going to do it. I wasn't so concerned about what it was going to sound like at the end. I could care less if you hate this track. That is maybe one of the intended results of making it. But the point is that you have an idea, you focus on that process, and whatever happens, you just let happen. Pushing your creativity is another big point. And this is one of the things that I try to stress to people who've been producing music for a very long time and are very good at what they do. But the one problem that you'll see again and again is that their music sounds the same consistently. And that's true for artists in pretty much any genre, from rock to hip hop to electronic music. So doing activities like this and doing things that are just so experimental can be great to make you do something outside of your comfort zone, to push outside of the box, which you can then bring back inside the box when you're making your more genre-based music. So now we'll actually look at the project, and we'll be focusing on two things. The first is extreme automation as compared to the extreme automation we saw before. And then this idea of one sample can be the equivalent of an entire world of sound. Looking at this project inside of Soundation, you can clearly see that there was a plan. You notice how the second instance of the vocal is falling, exactly a bar after this first one is finished, or it starts at the next bar after this is completed. And then over time, as we keep bringing in these new instances, they all start to fall ever so slightly closer until we get to a point where at the end of the composition, they've actually fallen right on top of each other. And this is more of a psychoacoustic idea of just what happens when you start to bring things closer. You get these interesting phase relationships, and it results in a kind of mushy and blurry and also very wide sound. And that's why over time, I want this composition to sound like it's getting wider. It's kind of pulling away from the center. So just again, that whole concept of deconstruction. The other thing I want you to look at is just how much automation has gone into some of these tracks. So let's just use, we can look at a couple of these. We'll begin with this texture at the beginning of the piece. And you can just hear how much that's constantly developing and constantly changing. And that's really taking automation to about as far as you can push it. We began with something that was just, if I could bypass all of these. So all that we started with was this. Which is just taking that one sample, reversing it, and stretching it out just a tiny bit. But then add in all of these effects, add in all of the imagination, and you get this beautiful atmospheric bed that accompanies the entire track and lays a bit of a groundwork for everything to start piling up on top of it. At least that's the idea in theory. But you probably wouldn't know that every single sound in here came from just one single sample which is another big part of why I made this track. I wanted you guys to see that you can take just one sample, and if you're really creative and if you really try hard, you can create a world of sound. And I could have created a lot more sounds here. I could have done things even more extreme if I spent a little bit more time on it, and if I wasn't sort of, peeking out the CPU or the limitations of this program, because once you start to add in all of these effects, it can get rather difficult to control everything. But that's another limitation of the program, which is a good limitation because it keeps you focused, it keeps you creative within some sort of bounds. The final question I added to this slide is, are there any practical applications to doing exercises like this? And I think that comes down to how you define what is and isn't practical. If you think all of this is just a bunch of pretentious BS, then by all means, don't do it. However, on the flip side, I think if you want to try to carve out a niche for yourself and do things that are truly unique, it might benefit you to do one of these little experimental tracks time and time again. You don't have to share them with anybody, but the benefit that I found of doing exercises like this is that you occasionally, and it doesn't happen every time, stumble across effects chains or automation moves that you would never do in a million years in one of your genre tracks, and you realize, oh my gosh, that actually works, and I could probably apply that in a situation down the road. And that's how you develop your unique sound, which is one of those buzzwords that people constantly talk about, but rarely does anyone give you any tips or pointers as to how you're going to find that unique sound. This is a perfect example of how you can go about doing that, because you're going to stumble across things that people making genre tracks just aren't going to do. They're never going to consider it. And that's really, I think, one of the big beauties of working with experimental music. Also, that you can make music that's designed for very critical listening. And if you're making genre tracks 90% of the time, you know that at the end of the day, no matter how many crazy and cool techniques you've done, it needs to be something that the average listener can just sit down, listen to, and enjoy. With experimental music, you can try to really get on people's nerves. You can do things that they're not going to enjoy or that are going to cause a lot of tension and unease. And I personally think that's a lot of fun.